Hello, in this video I want to consider the terms sociopath, psychopath and narcissist, and I want to look at Patrick Frazee, Chris Watts and Timothy Jones Jr. and look at the differences between them and the similarities as well. If you're not aware of Patrick Frazee, Timothy Jones Jr. or Chris Watts, I've done videos where I've explored them a bit more. So do have a look at those. I'm not going to be able to go into detail about their crimes in this video because it would just be a very long video if I did that, but I can summarise that Chris Watts murdered his pregnant wife and his 3 small children, and he did that last summer, and he dropped his children's bodies into oil into oil batteries, and Timothy Jones Jr. strangled his 5 children and then drove around with them in the back of his truck or his SUV for a few days. I think it was for 5 days before dropping them into a forest in bin liners. Patrick Frazee's trial is set for October, and he's pleaded not guilty to murdering his fiancée. The police believe he battered her to death with a baseball bat while their 1-year-old daughter was in the room next door, and that he asked her to put a blindfold on and to play a game of smelling candles, and when she was doing that he then hit her over the head and battered her to death. The term psychopath and the term sociopath are often used interchangeably, and there's a lot of confusion amongst experts about what each of them mean and what the differences actually are. The term psychopath was first used in 1900 about people who had no empathy, no remorse or guilt, and didn't seem to be bothered at all about not following the law. And then in the 1930s, this was changed to the word sociopath. They wanted to be clear about the way that these people were a danger and a menace to society, and so they wanted to focus on the impact they have socially, and so that's why they changed the name. And then later on they reverted back to using the term psychopath, and then it became the idea became that a psychopath was more severely damaged, and more of a danger than a sociopath, and that a sociopath was made and a psychopath was born. That was the theory. Since then, there's been more research, and it's been found that psychopaths, although they have different brains to normal people, it takes more than just genetics to behave like a psychopath, to be a danger to people. They have to also have experienced some kind of abuse or neglect as children. And there's also now information that suggests sociopaths also have different brains. Again, there's disagreement over whether that's true or whether it isn't true. One of the reasons I've said in the past that I think Chris Watts is a sociopath is that psychopaths are supposed to not feel shame or remorse. And I think Chris Watts did feel shame in many situations. And I also think Timothy Jones Jr. felt shame. He killed his children after his 6-year-old was crying for mum, and after his ex-wife Amber Kaiser was comforting him and telling Timothy Jones Jr. that he hadn't been behaving in the right way, he hadn't been parenting him in the right way. That's certainly how it would have come across to him. She was criticising him, and his son wanted his mum, and I talked about the kind of shame he would have felt as a result, and that shame would have sparked anger. And I've said the same about Chris Watts, about the rage that he would have had, and the kind of shame he would have felt in different situations. And so for that reason, I wouldn't say, if psychopath means someone who doesn't feel shame, I wouldn't say that either of those are a psychopath. In 1974, there was an experiment done where people were given a countdown and they were told they were going to get an electric shock at the end of it. And they used normal, in quotes, individuals and those who were thought to be psychopaths using the Hare characteristics, and I'll talk about those later in the video. Anyway, they found that the people who were psychopaths the part of their brain that would have responded to fear didn't light up. So those neurons were not active. Whereas normal people, when they were faced with the fear of having an electric shock, that part of their brain lit up. There was a lot of activity in those neurons. So because of this, Hare has said that psychopaths don't feel fear in the same way as we do, and they also apparently don't feel disgust in the way that we do. So you can show a psychopath a photo of something horrific, like a mutilated corpse, and they won't show an emotional reaction, whereas a normal person would show and feel disgust. Because of the fact that they don't tend to feel fear, if you give a psychopath a lie detector test, they can pass it in theory. They also don't start sweating during a situation where they might have been afraid. So a normal person might start to have sweaty palms and their heart might start to beat more quickly, but a psychopath won't have those reactions. And so if you think about the way that Chris Watts responded, you can see him quite visibly very scared when it looks like he might be caught out when the policeman is looking at the CCTV footage. And that's been the same, during the interviews he sometimes looked anxious, and during the police interrogation, and he also failed the lie detector test. I think Chris Watts comes across as somebody who can be quite nervous. So again, using that definition of psychopath, he wouldn't fall under that category, which is again why I've always referred to him as a sociopath. If you think about Patrick Frazee, I have less information on him and I've seen less footage of him. So I'm just going off the little that I've seen of him and what I've heard about the crime. And with him, I don't see him visibly looking scared. He looks very confident and relaxed in all the footage I've seen of him. I may have missed some. There might be some where he does look like that, but from what I've seen, he looks very calm, cool, and collected. Psychopaths have traditionally also been thought of as people who very coldly calculate a murder before it happens. Everything is planned out very carefully and in a very organised, detached fashion. And that's how I see the way that Patrick Frazee had initially attempted to carry out the murder of his fiancée. He'd been trying to get other people to murder her, and one of those people did end up cleaning up for him, Crystal, his girlfriend. But he also tried to get her to murder her and, to give her poison in her coffee, and there are a couple of other ways that he was trying to get her killed. So I think of that again as fitting with that perception of what a psychopath is, that everything was meticulously planned. And although it didn't work out, Crystal didn't end up feeling able to murder his fiancée, and although he did it himself, he also was really careful about the way he disposed of the body, and really careful even about getting someone else to clean it up. So again, it seems to me to be very detached and cold and calculating. If you think about Timothy Jones Jr., the way that he went about killing his children and the reasons for it, I think we see quite a different picture. I don't think that the murder of his son seems to have been premeditated. It seems that he murdered him when he was feeling really angry and out of control. That's the impression I have. And he did, it seems, murder his other children having thought about it. So that was premeditated according to the law, you know, in that he had time to think about it after killing his son. And he brought his 8-year-old daughter to the shop with him to get cigarettes so that she wouldn't call the police, apparently, you know. And you know, he then killed his children having given it some thought and decided that was the best thing to do. For, you know, because he'd already killed one of them. You know, he didn't really have a plan. He after killing them, he put all of their bodies in his truck, and he was just driving around. He was looking up on Google how to get rid of them, how to get rid of the bodies. So this wasn't something he'd thought about and organised really meticulously in advance. I think Chris Watts falls in between these two. I think he had premeditated these murders. That's what the police think anyway, and that's the impression I get from everything we know about the murders. He obviously didn't carry things out perfectly because he didn't know that Shanann was going to come home late, and he still decided to carry out the murders and then left evidence out in the field and evidence at home. I would say that those murders were more towards Patrick Frazee's style than Timothy Jones Jr.'s, because it does seem that he had a plan. You know, he'd organised to go out to the oil fields when his colleagues weren't going to be there. He'd asked that they weren't going to be there. So his plan didn't go quite right, and you know, he decided to go ahead and carry it out anyway, even though Shanann was delayed. So he made mistakes and so on, but he did still have a plan, and I don't think he murdered her in an out of control fit of anger as he claims. So, you know, again, so in that sense he seems more like Patrick Frazee, but they're not quite as organised. In my opinion, you know, he did make some mistakes, and he did seem to act a bit on impulse. She was late, and he could have, if he'd been, I suppose, more coldly detached from the whole thing, he might have put it off and done it in the future when everything went to plan. So I think he's maybe somewhere in between. So for these reasons, I've called him a sociopath. Timothy Jones Jr.'s mother was schizophrenic. I think she had various different problems, and she used to put him in ice cold baths when he was tiny. I think just he wasn't even 2, to tell him off and give him laxatives because she didn't want a fat baby. There would have been a lot of trauma at a very early age as well, and the younger a child is when they suffer trauma, the more damaged they can become later. He was then brought up by his father, and his mother was no longer in the picture to continue to traumatise him. With Chris Watts, we know a little bit about his parents and the way that they relate to each other and the way they related to him and to Shanann. My impression with Chris Watts is that he wasn't traumatised as a child, but that he was emotionally neglected over many years, that his mother idealised him for characteristics that weren't necessarily about who he really was. They were more about the way he could behave, the way he could fulfill emotional needs of other people, maybe her, and the way that he was really good at sport, you know, the things that he achieved. My impression of her is that she doesn't really show empathy. The way that she's talked about Shanann, even after she knew she'd been murdered, and the way that she behaved towards Cece with her nut allergy, all of that suggests to me that she was low in empathy, and growing up in that kind of environment would have meant that he would have been neglected emotionally. No matter how much she appears to dote on him, and no matter how many great things she says about him, I don't believe that he felt he could be himself when he was growing up, and I think that's why in court he can't meet the eyes of his parents, because they're seeing him for who he really is, maybe for the first time ever. And that was another reason I have referred to him as a sociopath, because I don't think that I don't think that something traumatic happened, and that it was, that genetically his brain was just completely different from a normal person's. My impression is that he became this way because of his childhood, and I don't want to suggest that there's nothing genetic involved. Genetics comes into everyone's personalities to some degree, but you're not born with a personality disorder. I think Chris Watts and Patrick Frazee both wear a mask that is potentially quite convincing, and they both mimic emotions. Timothy Jones Jr., it sounds like to an extent he did with Amber Kaiser at the beginning, that the way that he ended up devaluing her and controlling her was quite subtle and took time. But I would say compared to the other two, he was much quicker to behave in a really controlling way. And part of that would have been that his target, his victim, Amber, was more vulnerable. She was very young, she was 19, she'd been homeless before they met. And, I can't see Shanann agreeing to keep her hair really long and never wear trousers. Chris Watts didn't act like he was really controlling. I've called him a covert narcissist because he was very subtle, and watching from a distance, it looked more like Shanann was the one in control of the relationship, and that's how a covert narcissist operates. But with Timothy Jones Jr., he was more obviously in control. He did still wear a mask. Amber talks about how he seemed to dote on the children, and she agreed for him to be the primary caregiver, thinking that he would continue to dote on the children and that he would treat them differently to how he had treated her. I think part of that would have been his mask, but I think also that with Amber out of the picture, he needed to control and abuse someone, and so he turned on his children. And my impression of him is that his mask is not nearly as strong as Chris Watts's mask. During the trial, his face is very expressionless, and people have talked about how he was on medication at the time, and that may well be true, but then when you see him, when Amber Kaiser has broken down in her absolute tears, it's really horrendous to watch. But then at the same time, Timothy Jones Jr. is staring at her intently, watching, observing, and then is very easily distracted by his lawyers and moves into animated conversation with them. So he does seem quite with it. And Amber herself has talked about that and said, although he was apparently on medication, he actually seemed quite with it at other times and would just immediately start talking in a normal way. When Chris Watts was in court, he couldn't look at his parents, he couldn't look at Shanann's parents. He was moving his leg up and down, it seemed in quite an out of control way. And I think that that's because he didn't have his mask on. His mask had dropped because they knew what he'd done. And he was just falling apart because he had no mask. Whereas Timothy Jones Jr. could really look Amber Kaiser directly in the face and was interested in observing her. So, he wasn't, although he occasionally pretended to cry, I think at one point he did cry just when it was all about him, but generally he wasn't trying to keep anything up, and it didn't seem like he was destroyed because his mask had been destroyed, So I think there's quite a difference there. In that sense, I would say that Chris Watts is more like a psychopath than Timothy Jones Jr. in that, psychopaths are supposed to be able to be good at mimicking emotion, charming people, wearing this mask, having a very having a very sort of distant approach to what they're doing, whereas sociopaths can be more reckless and more impulsive. But this is again according to the more traditional way of viewing things. And when we do view things in that way, neither Chris Watts nor Timothy Jones Jr. really fit either profile very well. Chris Watts wouldn't fit being exactly a psychopath or being exactly a sociopath. He's somewhere in between. And Timothy Jones Jr. would not quite fit that description of a psychopath, but then he wouldn't completely fulfill the criteria of a sociopath, because if a psychopath is more severe, then in some ways he was. You know, he was talking about getting the bones of his children and I think sawing them down, making them into dust. So if a psychopath is more dangerous, is more severely disordered, and has less feeling than a sociopath, then grinding your children's bones down would be more likely to fit a psychopath. And yet he doesn't fit a psychopath in other ways. So I think we need to now look at a different way of viewing the term psychopath and sociopath. The DSM-5 criteria was revised in 2012. This criteria is used by psychologists and psychiatrists to diagnose people with personality disorders. And they don't have a term psychopath listed or sociopath. They have something called antisocial personality disorder, and they say that it encompasses both a psychopath and a sociopath. And the reason they've done this is because there's been so much disagreement about the two and what the differences are. In the 1970s, Robert Hare created a checklist for psychopaths, and it was more narrow than the antisocial personality disorder that's the more recent criteria. So the Hare checklist is also used. There's some disagreement about it. Certainly in the UK, people in the criminal justice system feel that you can't really use it to know if people are going to reoffend or not. That's something that Hare disagrees with. So he says that of the people in jail, about, I think he said 20% of them would be psychopaths according to his checklist, and 50% of really violent and really the most serious crimes like rape and murder, those perpetrators would be psychopaths. And he says that only 1 in 4 of people who have antisocial personality disorder would be psychopaths. So he sees it as much more exact and narrow, and he wants there to be a particular category just for psychopaths in the DSM-5 criteria, which is something that the organisation that created those criteria don't agree with. You know, they think psychopaths fit into their antisocial personality disorder. So according to Hare's criteria, there are 2 factors for somebody to be a psychopath. They have to have these two sets of characteristics. One of these factors correlates with narcissistic personality disorder: the pathological lying, the manipulative behaviour, lack of remorse, lack of guilt, lack of empathy, the superficial charm, failure to accept responsibility. All of that corresponds to narcissistic personality disorder. I think Patrick Frazee, Timothy Jones Jr. and Chris Watts all have these traits. Chris Watts manipulated everyone around him into thinking he was a really nice guy. With Patrick Frazee, we know from his ex-girlfriend that he manipulated her, that, you know, he came across as this really lovely, loving, kind guy. With Timothy Jones Jr., he was even prepared to say that he had schizophrenia, and, you know, he had been reading up on it on the internet to find out how schizophrenic traits are. So you know, this is extreme manipulation as well. So they all have these traits in maybe in slightly different ways they come across, but they all have these traits. They all have a degree of superficial charm. I think Chris Watts and Patrick Frazee have more of it. I think we can safely say that they're all pathological liars, that none of them feel remorse or guilt, and that none of them take any responsibility for what they've done. So factor 2, impulsivity. That's quite interesting, isn't it? Because that's not the traditional way of seeing a psychopath. You know, a sociopath was thought to be impulsive. The psychopath was thought to be very cold, calculating, distant, organised about their approach. So, you know, even the way that Hare sees things is different from that. And this is a male psychopath. Women who are psychopaths, for some reason, they don't fit this pattern. You know, they don't have these 2 factors involved. And they don't have to have all of these traits. You know, they have to have a certain number. So with Hare's traits, there are 20 different traits altogether. Each of the 20 items on the list is rated from 0 to 2. So with 0 being that it doesn't apply, with 1 being it partially applies, and 2 it applies reasonably well to the offender. And the highest you can score is 40. They have to score 30 to be considered a psychopath in the US. In England, they only have to score 25. So we've probably, you know, we're more likely to call someone a psychopath here. The Hare checklist is supposed to be answered during an interview, so that the answers are not just taken on their own. You know, they're combined with lots of other information about the person. And we don't have a lot of information. We don't know exactly what they were like at school. We don't know, we can't answer a lot of this. We don't know if they got bored easily, for example. That's one of the questions in the checklist. We don't know if they were generally irresponsible, or if there was juvenile delinquency, if there were problems with their behaviour during childhood. We haven't heard that there have been. So I guess the character we know the most about is Chris Watts. Juvenile delinquency doesn't seem to fit his profile from everything we do know about him. It hasn't been mentioned that there were these behavioural problems when he was a child. There's one episode that was made public about how he'd lied, and that was because he was the one that confessed it. That was about how he'd lied to his teacher when he was at school, and he'd pretended he'd been on holiday to China when he hadn't. He created this elaborate long story. That's quite an unusual thing to do. So that suggests there may have been some issues that were sort of evident early on. But we don't know about other behavioural problems. So we don't have enough information to decide what score we might give them on these different traits. None of them led a parasitic lifestyle. All 3 of them worked, and they were all in good jobs as well. If you look at this factor 2, you know, these traits, I don't think that Chris Watts does actually fulfill a lot of them. He could control his impulses very well, generally. You know, obviously then he had an affair, but the way he was day to day with his mask on, he pulled that off for years. So I'd say he could generally control his impulses. Whereas Timothy Jones Jr., it seems, couldn't. And I'll talk more about the way that he was with his children in another video. But the way that he would punish them shows that he was really just out of control of his rage, you know. And the fact that he did it that night, the fact that he killed his son, you know, he hadn't made any preparations for how he was going to dispose of his body or anything like that. That again suggests that he had a lack of impulse control. He just did it because he was really angry. The manipulativeness, the deceitfulness, and the callousness that are mentioned in the DSM-5 criteria for antisocial personality disorder, they do actually line up with factor 1. The lack of remorse and the lack of empathy that Hare talks about are also here in the DSM-5 criteria. You need to have more points in Hare's criteria to be called a psychopath. You don't have to have quite as many points to have antisocial personality disorder. To fulfill the DSM-5 criteria for antisocial personality disorder, somebody has to be impaired in self-functioning, identity, so egocentrism. Shallow affect is not openly talked about, and nor is not taking responsibility in the DSM-5 criteria. But you could think that that's what comes, that shallow affect comes from the egocentrism, and that not taking responsibility comes from a lack of remorse. They are manipulative, deceitful, callous, and hostile. They can have persistent or frequent angry feelings, or in response to minor slights. And they have to be impaired in interpersonal functioning, a lack of empathy, an inability to be intimate with people, disinhibition. They're irresponsible, they can be impulsive, they take dangerous risks. And in this risk-taking domain, it's interesting how they talk about lack of concern for one's limitations and denial of the reality of personal danger. I think that probably all three of them suffered from that. Chris Watts obviously thought he was going to get away with it, and Timothy Jones Jr. did as well. With Timothy Jones Jr., he actually killed his children with no plan about what he was going to do. He put them all into his truck and drove around researching at the same time. So that seems like a characteristic he definitely had. Patrick Frazee did think things through more carefully. He didn't quite get it right, though. Crystal told on him. And she did so for her own, so that she could get off, so that her sentence would be a lot lighter. But he didn't quite see that happening. I think all of this is related to an arrogance and a kind of delusion that they're sort of above the law and they're going to get away with it. With Timothy Jones Jr., that began, in my opinion, as a lack of impulse control, and it was followed up by premeditation. For Chris Watts and for Patrick Frazee, I think it was a result of the belief that they would get away with it and they wouldn't be caught. So some degree of this belief that there would be a lack of consequences, that's something that narcissists don't have in common with people who fit the DSM-5 criteria. And that would be one of the reasons why somebody who only has narcissistic personality disorder wouldn't kill, because they'd be afraid of what the consequences would be. I'm going to be looking at Timothy Jones Jr. a bit more, at the way that he behaved towards his children, in another video, and I'm going to be talking about the way I dealt with the rage of a narcissist in another video, and I'm going to be starting to cover some of the traits of narcissists, some of the ways that they behave to watch out for. So if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.